Marcus Chen had always been different from other architects. While his colleagues designed shopping malls and office buildings, he found himself drawn to something deeper, something that touched the human soul. At 35, he was successful by most standards, yet felt an emptiness that no amount of professional recognition could fill. The awakening came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. Marcus sat in his glass-walled office in downtown Seattle, staring at blueprints for another corporate tower. The gray sky outside matched his mood perfectly. His coffee had grown cold, and the architectural drawings before him seemed lifeless, mechanical. He pushed back from his desk and walked to the window, watching people hurry past on the sidewalk below, each lost in their own world. That's when his phone buzzed with an email that would change everything. The message came from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a professor of religious studies at the University of Washington. She had seen his work on the renovation of an old church downtown, and was impressed by how he had preserved its spiritual essence while modernizing its functionality. Mr. Chen, the email read, I am organizing a research expedition to document sacred architecture around the world. Your approach to ecclesiastical design suggests you understand that buildings can be more than mere structures. They can be gateways to the divine. Would you consider joining our team as the lead architectural photographer and analyst? Marcus read the message 3 times. Sacred architecture. Gateways to the divine. These weren't terms he heard often in his line of work, but they resonated with something deep inside him. He had always felt that the most beautiful buildings were those that made people feel something beyond themselves, that lifted their spirits toward something greater. Without hesitation, he typed his response. I'm interested. When do we start? Dr. Vasquez replied within hours, inviting him to a meeting that afternoon. Her office was tucked away in the basement of the theology building, surrounded by towers of books and photographs of churches, temples, and mosques from around the world. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. Sacred architecture, she explained as they sat surrounded by images of stunning religious buildings, is humanity's attempt to build bridges between earth and heaven. Every culture has tried to create spaces where the divine feels closer, more accessible. She showed him photographs that took his breath away. The soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. The intricate geometric patterns of Islamic mosques that created a sense of infinite complexity and perfect order. Hindu temples covered in countless carved figures, each telling a story of the sacred. Buddhist monasteries perched on impossible mountaintops, as if reaching toward enlightenment itself. This is different from regular architectural photography, Dr. Vasquez continued. We're not just documenting buildings. We're trying to capture the spiritual essence that the original builders embedded in stone and wood and glass. We're seeking to understand how these structures make people feel closer to whatever they consider divine. Marcus felt the excitement he hadn't experienced in years. Where would we go? Everywhere. Her eyes lit up. We'll start in Europe, exploring the great cathedrals of France and England. Then we'll move to the Byzantine churches of Eastern Europe, with their golden domes and mystical interiors. From there, the ancient temples of Asia, the sacred sites of the Middle East, the unique spiritual architecture of Latin America, and the emerging sacred spaces of the modern world. The project would take 2 years. Marcus would need to leave his comfortable job, his predictable life, his safe routine. But as he looked at the photographs spread across Dr. Vasquez's desk, he knew he had to say yes. Something in those images called to him, promising answers to questions he hadn't even known he was asking. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing in the early morning mist outside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The project team was small but passionate. Dr. Vasquez, a historian named James Wright, who specialized in religious art, a cultural anthropologist called Sarah Kim, and Marcus himself. Notre Dame rose before them like a stone prayer frozen in time. Even with the recent fire damage, even with the scaffolding and reconstruction work, the cathedral maintained its power to inspire awe. Marcus had seen it in photographs countless times, but standing before it in person was entirely different. Look at how the builders used vertical lines, Dr. Vasquez said softly, her voice filled with reverence. Everything draws the eye upward. The pointed arches, the flying buttresses, the soaring spires, its architecture designed to lift the human spirit toward God. Marcus raised his camera, a high-end digital device capable of capturing extraordinary detail, and began to work. But this wasn't like any photography he had done before. He wasn't just documenting the building's structure. He was trying to capture its soul. He noticed how the morning light filtered through the rose windows, casting colored shadows on the stone floor. Each window told a story from Christian tradition, but the light itself seemed to transform the interior space into something otherworldly. The massive columns stretched upward, creating a forest of stone that made visitors feel both small and elevated. As the day progressed and the light changed, Marcus saw how the cathedral transformed with each passing hour. The harsh morning light gave way to a softer afternoon glow, and finally, to the mysterious shadows of evening. Each transformation revealed different aspects of the building's character. The medieval builders understood something we've forgotten, James Wright observed as they worked. They knew that sacred space isn't just about function. It's about creating an environment that changes how people feel, how they think, how they relate to the divine. Inside the cathedral, Marcus was struck by the acoustics. Every footstep echoed. Every whispered conversation seemed to take on greater significance. When a small choir began to practice, their voices soared through the space, amplified and enriched by the stone architecture, until the music seemed to come from heaven itself. Sarah Kim, the anthropologist, was documenting how modern visitors interacted with the space. "Watch how people behave differently here," she noted. "They lower their voices instinctively. They move more slowly. Even non-religious visitors seem to sense that this is a special place." Marcus observed the same phenomenon. Tourists who had been chattering loudly on the street fell silent as they entered. Children who had been running around became subdued, not from fear or boredom, but from an intuitive understanding that this space demanded a different kind of behavior. Over the following weeks, the team moved through France's great cathedrals. At Chartres, Marcus was amazed by the labyrinth set into the floor, a walking meditation that medieval pilgrims had followed as a spiritual exercise. At Sainte-Chapelle, he was overwhelmed by walls that seemed to be made entirely of stained glass, creating an interior that felt like standing inside a jewel. Each cathedral was unique, yet all shared certain characteristics. They were built to inspire awe, to make humans feel both humble and elevated. They used light as a building material, employing windows and openings to create atmosphere and meaning. They incorporated symbols and stories into their very structure, so that the buildings themselves became religious texts written in stone. Gothic architecture was called music frozen in stone, Dr. Vasquez explained as they stood in the nave of Reims Cathedral. The builders were trying to create harmony in physical form, to make buildings that would resonate with the human soul the way music does. Marcus began to understand that sacred architecture was about more than beauty or even craftsmanship. It was about creating spaces that facilitated transcendence, that helped humans connect with something beyond their everyday concerns. These weren't just buildings. They were spiritual technologies, devices designed to alter consciousness and open hearts. As their first month in France drew to a close, Marcus found himself changed by the experience. He saw architecture differently now. He understood that the most powerful buildings weren't necessarily the most expensive or the most technically advanced, but those that touched something deep in the human spirit. Standing in the evening light streaming through the windows of Sainte-Chapelle, surrounded by colors that seemed to have been borrowed from paradise itself, Marcus realized that he had found his true calling. He wasn't just documenting buildings anymore. He was exploring humanity's eternal quest to build bridges between earth and heaven, to create spaces where the sacred could dwell among mortals. The journey had only just begun, but already Marcus knew that it would transform not only his understanding of architecture, but his understanding of what it meant to be human. In these ancient stones, he was discovering truths that had been built into the very foundations of human civilization. The deep need for beauty, for meaning, for connection with something greater than ourselves. As they prepared to leave for England and the next phase of their Odyssey, Marcus looked back at Notre Dame one final time. The cathedral stood against the darkening sky like a prayer made manifest, its towers reaching towards stars that were just beginning to appear. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new insights into the mysterious relationship between the human spirit and the sacred spaces humans create to house their highest aspirations. The gates of heaven, Marcus was beginning to understand, weren't found in some distant realm. They were here, built by human hands from earthly materials, yet somehow managing to open doorways to the infinite, and he had only just begun to explore them. 6 months into their journey, Marcus Chen stood before the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, feeling like he was about to step into a different world entirely. The massive dome seemed to hover impossibly in the air, defying gravity and logic. After months of studying Gothic cathedrals with their vertical emphasis and pointed arches, the Byzantine approach to sacred architecture was a revelation. The team had traveled through England's great cathedrals, from the imposing Norman strength of Durham to the delicate fan vaulting of King's College Chapel in Cambridge. Each building had taught Marcus something new about how humans sought to create sacred space. But nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming presence of Hagia Sophia. Dr. Vasquez stood beside him, her notebook already filling with observations. For nearly 1,000 years, this was the largest cathedral in the world, she said. The builders were trying to create heaven on earth, a space that would overwhelm visitors with the glory of God. Marcus raised his camera and began to capture the exterior. But he knew the real magic lay inside. The building had served as a church, then a mosque, and now stood as a museum, bearing the architectural DNA of multiple faiths. Minarets added by Ottoman architects reached skyward alongside the original Byzantine dome, creating a unique fusion of spiritual traditions. Inside, Marcus felt his breath catch. The vast interior space seemed to expand infinitely upward. The central dome, supported by half-domes and massive pillars, created a sense of floating weightlessness. Light poured in through windows arranged around the dome's base, making the ceiling appear to glow with divine radiance. The builders called it the Dome of Heaven, James Wright explained, his voice echoing in the vast space. They were trying to recreate the celestial sphere in physical form. Marcus noticed how different this felt from the Gothic cathedrals they had studied. Where Gothic architecture drew the eye upward through vertical lines, Byzantine architecture created a sense of being enveloped by the sacred. The dome seemed to embrace visitors, surrounding them with divine presence rather than directing them toward it. The walls were covered with mosaics that told stories in gold and precious stones. Even after centuries and various religious transformations, the artistic program still communicated spiritual truths. Marcus spent hours photographing these details, trying to capture how the artists had used light and color to create images that seemed to glow with inner life. Sarah Kim was documenting how the space affected visitors from different cultural backgrounds. Muslims who come here still feel its sacred quality, she observed. Even though it's no longer an active mosque, they instinctively remove their shoes and speak in hushed tones. The sacred architecture transcends specific religious boundaries. From Istanbul, the team traveled deeper into the Eastern Orthodox world. In the monasteries of Mount Athos in Greece, Marcus encountered a completely different approach to sacred space. These weren't grand public buildings designed to impress, but intimate spiritual workshops where monks had pursued enlightenment for over 1,000 years. The Catholicon of the Great Lavra Monastery was smaller than the great cathedrals, but no less powerful. The interior was covered entirely with frescoes depicting biblical scenes and saints, creating an environment where every surface told a spiritual story. The iconostasis, a wall of icons separating the nave from the altar, created a sense of mystery and transcendence. Orthodox church architecture is designed to represent the kingdom of heaven, explained Father Maximos, an elderly monk who served as their guide. When you enter, you're meant to feel that you've stepped out of ordinary time and into eternal time. Marcus photographed the play of candlelight across the ancient frescoes, the way incense smoke curled through shafts of sunlight, the weathered faces of monks lost in prayer. Here, sacred architecture wasn't about impressing visitors with size or technical prowess, but about creating an environment that supported deep spiritual practice. The team's next destination challenged their understanding even further. In India, they encountered Hindu temple architecture that operated on completely different principles from anything they had studied in Europe. The Meenakshi temple in Madurai rose before them like a mountain of carved stone, its towering gopurams covered with thousands of colorful sculptures. Hindu temple design is based on ancient treatises that describe the temple as a cosmic diagram, explained Dr. Priya Sharma, a local expert who joined their team. Every measurement, every proportion, every decorative element has symbolic meaning. Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the sensory richness of the temple, where European sacred architecture often relied on empty space and soaring heights to inspire awe. Hindu temples filled every available surface with carvings that told stories from ancient epics and religious texts. Pilgrims moved through the complex in ritual patterns, their circumambulation turning their visit into a form of moving meditation. The central shrine, housing the main deity, was deliberately small and dark, reached through a series of increasingly intimate chambers. The journey from the bright outer courtyard to the dark inner sanctum represents the spiritual journey from the material world to divine consciousness, Dr. Sharma explained. Marcus had to completely adjust his photographic approach. The abundance of detail meant that wide shots failed to capture the temple's essence, while close-ups of individual carvings lost the sense of overwhelming abundance. He learned to photograph the pilgrims' interactions with the space, capturing how they touched certain statues for blessings, how they moved in prescribed patterns, how their faces changed as they progressed deeper into the temple. In the ancient caves of Ellora, carved directly into cliffsides over centuries, Marcus encountered yet another approach to sacred architecture. These weren't built structures but sculpted spaces, where architects had removed stone rather than adding it. The Kailasanatha temple was carved from a single massive rock, creating a three-dimensional mandala of incredible complexity. The builders were creating Mount Kailash, the mythical home of Lord Shiva. Dr. Sharma explained as they explored the carved chambers and passages. They were literally carving heaven out of the earth. Standing in the carved courtyard, surrounded by stone elephants and mythical beings, Marcus felt he was in a place where the boundary between imagination and reality had dissolved. The sculptors had created a world where divine beings seemed to inhabit every surface, where stories from ancient texts played out in endless stone dramas. The team's journey continued through the Buddhist monasteries of the Himalayas, where architecture seemed to emerge organically from the mountain landscape itself. At Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, perched on a seemingly impossible slope, Marcus discovered buildings that worked with the natural environment rather than dominating it. The monastery's main assembly hall, with its massive wooden columns and colorful banners, created a sense of warmth and community in the harsh mountain environment. The walls were lined with shelves holding ancient texts, while butter lamps flickered before golden statues of Buddhist deities. Prayer wheels spun constantly as monks and pilgrims circulated through the complex, their movement turning the building into a living mandala. Buddhist architecture is designed to support meditation and contemplation, explained Venerable Tenzin, the monastery's abbot. We don't build to impress, but to create environments that calm the mind and open the heart. Marcus spent weeks in the Himalayas, documenting how these sacred buildings existed in harmony with their landscape. Unlike the European cathedrals that seemed to challenge heaven itself, or the Hindu temples that created cosmic diagrams on earth, Buddhist monasteries felt like natural extensions of the mountain environment, places where human architecture and divine landscape merged seamlessly. In the ancient Buddhist caves of Ajanta, carved from cliffsides over 6 centuries, Marcus encountered some of the most sophisticated sacred interiors he had ever seen. The caves combined architecture, sculpture, and painting into unified artistic programs that transformed rock chambers into Buddhalands, earthly paradises where enlightened beings dwelt in eternal bliss. The paintings, preserved by the cave's protected environment, showed him how the original builders had conceived sacred space as total environments. Every surface contributed to a unified vision designed to inspire specific spiritual states in visitors. The flowing lines of painted figures, the lotus patterns on carved ceilings, the way natural light was channeled and controlled to create specific effects. Everything worked together to create spaces that felt like stepping into spiritual dreams. As their time in Asia drew to a close, Marcus found himself profoundly changed by what he had experienced. Each tradition had approached the challenge of creating sacred space in radically different ways, yet all shared a common understanding that architecture could be a spiritual tool a means of facilitating human connection with the divine. The Gothic cathedrals had taught him about aspiration, about reaching toward transcendence through vertical movement and soaring space. The Byzantine churches had shown him how architecture could embrace and envelop, creating environments where the divine presence seemed to surround visitors. The Hindu temples had revealed how buildings could serve as cosmic diagrams, maps of spiritual reality encoded in stone. The Buddhist monasteries had demonstrated how sacred architecture could work in harmony with natural environment, supporting meditation and contemplation. Standing in the ancient stupa at Sanchi, one of Buddhism's oldest architectural monuments, Marcus reflected on how much his understanding had expanded. The simple stone dome, surrounded by elaborately carved gates, represented yet another approach to sacred space. Not soaring toward heaven like a Gothic cathedral, not embracing like a Byzantine dome, not overwhelming with detail like a Hindu temple, but creating a still point, a center of calm that seemed to radiate peace into the surrounding landscape. As the sun set behind the stupa, casting long shadows across the ancient stone, Marcus realized that sacred architecture wasn't about any single style or tradition. It was about humanity's universal impulse to create physical spaces that could house spiritual aspirations, to build bridges between the material and the transcendent. Each tradition had found its own answers to fundamental questions. How do we create spaces that make people feel closer to the divine? How do we use light, proportion, decoration, and symbolism to facilitate spiritual experience? How do we build structures that last, not just physically, but spiritually, continuing to inspire generations of visitors across centuries and cultural changes? Tomorrow, the team would fly to the Middle East to encounter yet more approaches to these eternal questions. But tonight, sitting in the peaceful courtyard of their guest house near Sanchi, Marcus felt he was beginning to understand something profound about human nature itself. That the drive to create beauty, to reach for transcendence, to build monuments to our highest aspirations, was perhaps the most fundamental thing about what it meant to be human. The gates of heaven, he was learning, took many forms, but they all opened in the same direction, toward something greater than ourselves, something that lifted the human spirit beyond the limitations of ordinary existence into realms of beauty, meaning, and transcendent truth. 18 months into their Odyssey, Marcus Chen found himself standing in the courtyard of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, feeling as though he had discovered the secret of the universe written in stone and light. The forest of horseshoe arches stretched endlessly in all directions, creating a space that seemed to exist outside normal geometric laws. Red and white voussoirs alternated in hypnotic patterns, while columns salvaged from Roman and Visigothic buildings created a palimpsest of civilizations. The team had spent months in the Middle East, documenting the sacred architecture of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They had stood in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where different Christian denominations had created a complex architectural dialogue within a single sacred space. They had photographed the Western Wall, where ancient stones held the prayers and tears of countless generations. They had explored the intricate geometric patterns of the Dome of the Rock, where Islamic architects had created a structure that seemed to crystallize mathematical perfection into physical form. But the Mezquita of Cordoba represented something different, a building that had served multiple faiths while maintaining its own unique spiritual identity. Built as a mosque, later converted to a cathedral, it bore the architectural DNA of Islamic, Christian, and even Roman sacred traditions. This is what happens when sacred architectures meet and influence each other, Dr. Vasquez observed as they moved through the forest of columns. Instead of destroying what came before, the builders found ways to incorporate and transform previous traditions. Marcus raised his camera to capture the interplay between the original Islamic arches and the Gothic chapel that had been inserted into the center of the mosque. The contrast should have been jarring, but somehow it worked. The soaring vertical lines of the Gothic addition seemed to grow naturally from the horizontal rhythm of the Islamic arches, creating a visual conversation between different approaches to the sacred. James Wright was documenting the complex iconographic program that had evolved over centuries. Look at how Islamic geometric patterns coexist with Christian figurative art, he noted. Each tradition has maintained its integrity while being enriched by contact with the other. In the mihrab, the ornately decorated niche that indicated the direction of Mecca, Marcus found some of the most intricate architectural decoration he had ever encountered. Byzantine mosaicists, working for Islamic patrons, had created patterns that seemed to pulse with inner life. The golden tessellations caught and reflected light in ways that made the walls seem to breathe. From Spain, the team traveled to Morocco, where Islamic sacred architecture had developed along different lines. The Hassan II Mosque in Casablanca represented modern Islamic architecture at its most ambitious, a building that honored traditional forms while incorporating contemporary materials and techniques. The mosque's minaret, towering over 200 meters into the sky, was visible from throughout the city. Its exterior was covered with traditional geometric patterns executed in modern materials, creating surfaces that seemed to shift and change as the light moved across them throughout the day. Inside, the prayer hall could accommodate over 25,000 worshippers. Its vast space unified by repetitive geometric patterns that created both intimacy and grandeur. Islamic architecture has always been about creating infinite space through finite means, explained Dr. Ahmed Al-Mansouri, a scholar of Islamic art who had joined their team in Morocco. The geometric patterns suggest endless repetition, boundless space, the infinite nature of divine creation. Marcus spent days photographing the intricate tilework that covered every surface of the mosque. The craftsmen had created patterns so complex that the eye could never fully comprehend them, yet so harmonious that they created a profound sense of peace. Each geometric shape related to every other in mathematical relationships that seemed to encode the underlying order of creation itself. The team's next destination took them to Peru, where they encountered the unique sacred architecture of the Andes. At Machu Picchu, Marcus photographed structures that seemed to grow directly from the mountain ridge they occupied. The Intihuatana stone, precisely positioned to track the sun's movement throughout the year, demonstrated how Andean architects had created buildings that served as astronomical instruments, connecting human communities with cosmic rhythms. Andean sacred architecture was designed to harmonize human settlements with the natural and celestial worlds, explained Dr. Carmen Mendoza, an expert in pre-Columbian architecture. Every structure was positioned according to astronomical and geographic principles that connected earth and sky. The precision of the stone fitting at Machu Picchu amazed Marcus. Massive blocks were joined so perfectly that not even a knife blade could fit between them, yet no mortar had been used. The builders had created structures designed to flex and move with earthquakes, working with natural forces rather than resisting them. In Cusco's cathedral, built on the foundation of an Inca palace, Marcus encountered yet another example of architectural dialogue between traditions. Spanish colonial architects had incorporated Inca stonework into their Christian church, creating a building that honored both conquest and continuity. Native Andean artists had painted Christian saints with indigenous features and symbols, creating an artistic synthesis that spoke to the complex reality of cultural encounter. The team's journey through Latin America continued to the unique Baroque churches of Mexico, where indigenous artisans working under Spanish direction had created sacred spaces unlike anything in Europe. The Church of Santo Domingo in Oaxaca was covered with elaborate stucco decorations that seemed to grow organically from the walls, creating an environment of overwhelming sensory richness. Mexican Baroque architecture represents the fusion of European and indigenous aesthetic traditions. Dr. Mendoza explained, indigenous artisans took European architectural forms and filled them with their own understanding of sacred decoration. Marcus photographed the intricate gold leaf altarpieces that covered the church's interior, each surface alive with carved angels, saints, and symbolic vegetation. The effect was overwhelming yet somehow coherent, as if the entire church had been conceived as a single elaborate sculpture designed to transport visitors into a realm of divine splendor. As their 2-year journey neared its end, the team returned to the United States to document contemporary sacred architecture. At Frank Gehry's Chapel of St. Columba in Los Angeles, Marcus encountered sacred space, designed according to completely modern principles yet somehow achieving effects similar to the ancient buildings they had studied. The chapel's flowing metallic surfaces caught and reflected light in ways that seemed to make the building itself come alive. Inside, The space curved and folded in ways that created intimate areas within a larger whole, demonstrating how contemporary architects were finding new solutions to the eternal challenge of creating sacred space. At Tadao Ando's Church of Light in Osaka, which the team visited during a brief extension of their journey, Marcus photographed one of the most powerful sacred spaces he had ever encountered. The concrete walls were pierced by a simple cruciform opening that filled the interior with dramatic natural light. The stark simplicity was overwhelming in its spiritual impact, proving that sacred architecture didn't require elaborate decoration to achieve transcendent effects. Modern sacred architecture is learning to work with light and space in ways that the ancients would recognize, Dr. Vasquez observed as they documented Ando's church. The specific forms are contemporary, but the underlying principles are eternal. Throughout their final months, Marcus found himself synthesizing everything they had learned. Sacred architecture, he realized, wasn't about any particular style or tradition. It was about understanding how physical space could facilitate spiritual experience, how buildings could serve as technologies for transcendence, whether achieved through the soaring verticality of Gothic cathedrals, the embracing domes of Byzantine churches, the overwhelming decoration of Hindu temples, the geometric perfection of Islamic mosques, the astronomical precision of Andean structures, or the minimalist power of contemporary sacred spaces. All successful sacred architecture shared certain characteristics. It used light as a primary building material, understanding that illumination could transform space and consciousness. It employed proportion and geometry to create harmony and beauty that spoke to something deep in human nature. It incorporated symbolism and meaning into structural elements, making buildings that could be read as well as experienced. It created environments that changed how people felt and behaved, facilitating states of consciousness conducive to spiritual experience. As the team prepared their final documentation in a small chapel designed by Peter Zumthor in rural Switzerland, Marcus reflected on how much he had changed during their Odyssey. He had begun as a conventional architect interested in sacred buildings. He was ending as something closer to a spiritual archaeologist, someone who had learned to read the deepest human aspirations in stone and wood and glass. The Bruder Klausfield Chapel was almost primitively simple. Wooden logs burned from the inside to create a rough interior surface, with a single opening in the roof to admit light. Yet sitting in its dark interior, watching the circle of sky visible through the opening slowly change color as sunset approached, Marcus felt he was experiencing something as profound as anything they had encountered in the world's greatest cathedrals. All sacred architecture, he wrote in his final project notes, is ultimately about the same thing: creating physical spaces where the human spirit can touch something beyond itself. The forms change, the materials evolve, the symbolic programs vary according to culture and time, but the fundamental impulse remains constant. Their documentation project had produced thousands of photographs, hours of video, extensive written analysis, and detailed architectural drawings. But for Marcus, the real achievement was less tangible: a transformed understanding of what architecture could be and do. Standing in the chapel's dark interior as night fell, Marcus realized that sacred architecture wasn't just about buildings that housed religious activities. It was about humanity's eternal effort to create beauty, meaning, and transcendence in physical form. Every great work of sacred architecture was both a product of its specific cultural moment and a reaching toward something universal and timeless. The gates of heaven, Marcus had learned, weren't located in some distant realm. They were here, built by human hands from earthly materials, yet somehow managing to open doorways to experiences that transformed everyone who encountered them. From the Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe to the contemporary sacred spaces of modern architects, humans had never stopped trying to build bridges between earth and heaven. As their odyssey concluded, Marcus knew that his real journey was just beginning. He had discovered his true calling, not just as an architect, but as someone who understood that the most important buildings were those that nurtured the human spirit. In a world increasingly dominated by purely functional structures, the ancient wisdom embedded in sacred architecture offered hope that beauty, meaning, and transcendence would always find ways to manifest in human civilization. The sacred, Marcus had learned, wasn't something that existed apart from the material world. It was something that emerged when human creativity and spiritual aspiration combined to transform ordinary matter into doorways to the infinite. And as long as humans continued to reach for something greater than themselves, they would continue to build gateways to heaven, each one unique to its time and place, yet all participating in humanity's eternal dialogue with the divine.